You should try it in the morning.
Oh my God, my shit was on this whole time. So sorry. Oh, it's 7:10. Sorry, running a little bit late. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. So today we're going to do a little bit more discussion around the 1920s, and we'll be talking about the rise of zoning, particularly in Los Angeles, and especially hopefully challenging the dominant narrative about how zoning came about. Let me get a jacket on, it's super cold. I mean, this stuff is important, you know, like people always making fun of it, like, like city council, zoning, that's like so boring. Like, but actually it's really important. Jake knows. Jake covers city politics for the Daily Cow. Any interesting zoning stories in Berkeley recently, Jake?
Oh yeah, there was a pretty big one last week. We covered it a couple of times where they kind of passed a symbolic commitment to end exclusionary zoning practices throughout the city by 2022, with like very few exceptions. Basically citing like the sort of racist history of zoning in the city, because I'm sure you're going to touch on it, or maybe not, because this is an LA class, but Berkeley was the first city in the country to enact zoning laws in like 1916, and it was almost expressly to keep like the poor folks and the people of color out of certain neighborhoods.
So it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. And the interesting thing is, I think it's lost upon people the racial dynamics of zoning, because what zoning is it determines use types and it determines structure. And today's lecture is mostly going to talk about the rise of the separated use types, which before the 20th century in American cities didn't really exist. That was something that came about really rapidly around 1916. So anyway, let's get into it. First, I want to introduce a couple concepts. The first one is from this week's a reading for this week from Fischel, from chapter 5 of Zoning Rules, the Economics of Land Use. and that is the home voter. Fischel is pretty authoritative urban economist slash historian, and he really does a wonderful job giving an economics perspective into the history of cities. And one of the important contributions that he's made to urban theory is the concept of the home voter, which is really a political economy concept, which says that there is a dominant class of people in American society who, because of the way home ownership works, which is you essentially pour most of your liquid assets as either an individual or a family into a piece of land, and then you're expected to accumulate further wealth from the appreciation of the value of that land. So first of all, you have a major financial incentive to engage in local politics. And second of all, you have what they would call a low cost of political organizing, because your children go to the same schools, you have highly homogenized social networks, and everyone who lives in your community, because of the way American cities are built, probably look very similar to you in terms of race and socioeconomic status. So that is the concept of the home voter. The next one is the philosophy of the home voter, which is parochialism. And you might recognize this word from, the term parochial school, or generally something that relates to religion. But in a lot of, if you've been reading Mike Davis's City of Courts, or a lot of, especially like Marxist geography or planning history, the term kind of applies to a certain mindset that really values individual concerns above communal ones. And the Fogelson reading used this word to describe a lot of the political processes that steered Los Angeles in the way it did. And the way I use, I bring it up so that if the adjective is used, it doesn't offend anyone as it relates to like religion, but it relates more to this kind of like rural mindset. So I wanted to start with the zoning map that is in use today, my hometown, South Pasadena. This is actually a really fantastic zoning map to show you the kind of typical planning paradigm in Los Angeles. So I kind of wanted to try just asking people, what information can they glean from looking at this map about the city itself? And I don't know if you could easily read the legend either. You kind of have to reference the legend.
Pretty low density, I would say.
Low density overall, like not a lot of people per acre. Are you looking at like the residential zoning, the widespread yellow areas, which you can only build single family homes in?
Low density, and are the estates also single family like how zoning?
Yeah, estate is basically like single family zoning except less dense.
Gotcha. Okay. Right.
Mansions, basically.
Not a lot of areas of mixed use, lots of urban sprawl.
Yep, it's pretty much like commercial or residential. Any other observations?
Doesn't seem like there's a lot of like intermingling of different land uses. Like you look at where high density residential is, and it's like very kind of circumscribed to these like very specific locations. You don't see any high density intermingling with low density. It's very color coded.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if you look at where the high density areas are, which are the burgundy and sort of pink colors, they're, and you can't really tell from this map, and you'd have to kind of have a little bit of context, but higher density or commercial uses are centered around highly trafficked arteries, which is something that is so commonplace in the way we think about the cities that we typically, especially as Californians, live in, that we don't really, understand what the precedent of that pattern is. And I would also particularly point to the orange area in the top right. That wide boulevard that goes through and loops is actually a freeway. It's the 110 Parkway, the Arroyo Parkway, which is actually the first freeway to be built in Southern California. Robert Moses brought the Parkway to New York prior to this. And you have Fair Oaks, the major north-south boulevard connecting to Huntington Drive at the bottom, named after our now familiar friend Henry Huntington of the Pacific Electric fame. And you can really see these dark orange areas are centered around areas of high traffic impact. And, if you're in the field of public health today, some questions that come out of this are, air quality, disparate health impacts. Why are areas of higher density where there are literally more human beings centered around less desirable places? And why is it, when you look at this map, the kind of hierarchy, the pyramid of is ordered such that single family, non-dense housing is in the nicest areas? And you also can't, derive the topography, but the bottom left is, those are the hills. So we're focusing on the era now exiting the street, at the tail end of the streetcar dominance in Southern California. And we're going to be talking mostly about the interwar years, where there was a great, huge boom in Southern California. And I want to return to this question, which has kind of been threaded throughout our discussion so far, of Los Angeles exceptionalism. Sorry, my notes are like super messy this week. I gotta find what I'm gonna read off of. Okay. Also, I'm gonna preface this by saying this author is like pretty racist. So by 1885, the separation of homes from stores and shops accompanied the expansion of Los Angeles. Many businessmen moved from central to southern Los Angeles, while retailers followed the residential subdivisions. And most of these, the prevailing pattern at the time, before there was kind of explicit zoning, or even before that, land use regulations in the forms of districts, was that a lot of firms would center around Temple Street in downtown LA. You can kind of see that pattern in this orthogonal aerial image. And residential uses would cluster around the LA River. So here's also kind of an old tourist map that gives you a good bird's eye view, I guess. Craftsmen spread all over the south central section. Incipient industrialists who consider this district too congested and costly sought larger and cheaper parcels elsewhere. Some attempted to exploit local water power by constructing close to the LA River. Others followed their lead when the Southern Pacific routed its main line alongside the river. And so here you can see the industrial uses alongside the LA River. This is sort of a north-south perspective. And the reason why is really important to keep in mind, which is that before, and we'll get into this more, but before the rise of the car as the popular form of transportation, industry really relied upon either rail to transport raw commodities, or ports to do the same. And so because a rail line was built along the eastern edge of the LA River at this time, which is now, that piece of land called Taylor Yard, if you're familiar, is where the rail hub that used to connect to Salt Lake City was. A lot of heavy industry would cluster around that area. By 1930, the structure of Greater Los Angeles differed radically from the typical American metropolis, a divergence not wholly attributable to the material progress of Southern California. So what were some of the factors that contributed to LA exceptionalism? We can look at chronology. Los Angeles grew from the period of the horse, then electric railway, but then again, so did Detroit and Michigan. We can look at geography. The southern and western plains extended to the ocean, and northern and eastern valleys to the mountains. So no natural barriers concentrated settlement. But then again, so did Milwaukee and Cleveland have a lack of topological constraint. We can look at transportation, the connection between the electric railways and real estate subdivisions, and the subsequent monopolization of the street and interurban lines by Huntington and the other rail tycoon Harriman, spurred the creation of an extensive radial transit network, which we talked in depth about last week. Oh, we'll go back to here then. We can look at utilities, the municipalization of the water system, what we call LADWP today, and the highway authorities and the Metropolitan Water District provided motor thoroughfares and domestic water to places off the railroads and outside LA. Both local and state commissions compelled the gas, electric, and telephone utilities to serve customers whenever they deposited funds to construct additions to the distributing systems. So California was one of these states that first really pioneered this policy implement of first of all, creating utility regulations or public utility commissions that would regulate certain private industries that were deemed of such public importance that the state would use its police powers to kind of make it a quasi semi-public private entity. But in Los Angeles, one of the great contributing factors to horizontal expansion was that there was a legal mandate where if someone were to build a house in an area that was outside of the immediate territory of a given utility, the utility would be legally obligated to begin to serve that new person. So this was a major, not a push factor, but a facilitating factor in what allowed subdividers to expand the urban periphery. The unique dispersal of Los Angeles reflected not so much its chronology, geology, or technology as the exceptional character of its population. And this is really where the author Fogelson becomes very problematic. And I think that, in hindsight, we can really disagree with what's being said here, but I'm going to kind of go over it because it really gives you a good illustration of the dominance of parochialism. The unique dispersal, Chicago was inhabited by impoverished European immigrants confined to tenements. The model of dispersed metropolis, Los Angeles was populated principally by, and he uses this term, Native Americans, which he actually means white people born in the US, with adequate resource and marketable skills who face the problems of adjustment confidently because of a common language and similar background. Moreover, the Native Americans, white people, came to Los Angeles with a conception of good community which was embodied in single-family houses located on large lots, surrounded by landscape lawns and isolated from business activities. Their vision was epitomized by the residential suburb, spacious, affluent, clean, decent, permanent, predictable, and homogeneous. Here was the basis for the extraordinary dispersal of Los Angeles. So once again, we return to the commodification of the dream, the booster romance of Los Angeles as the Anglo paradise, the single family home, the Midwesterner's dream of retiring from the farm and making money from the land value appreciation of buying a plot of land in Los Angeles. This was, once again, a major force in its population boom. So here's a graph showing, I mean, it's kind of hard to read, it's a lot of numbers, but number of families per thousand. You know, at this time, Los Angeles was nowhere near New York, which in 1930 had more than 1 million people. But I want to just point you to the significant column of this graph is the incredibly high proportion of structures in LA in 1930 that were single family detached. Los Angeles at this time, you know, as we described, because of the bungalow boom and the pattern of boosterism and, you know, real estate subdivision, had an incredibly high rate of home ownership and an incredibly high rate of single family units. On our right is a image of the historical boundaries of the municipality of Los Angeles, which we'll get more into. How are we doing on time? 7:30. Okay. The other major legal implement at this time to kind of deal with different land uses were covenants. Okay. Let's talk about pre-zoning land use policies a little bit later. Dang, do I have any better maps in here? No, I don't. Okay, we're gonna look at the same maps. Sorry, they're not that good. Oh, goodness. Okay. So another important thing to mention is kind of the patterns of both land use and racial segregation that were emerging in the 1920s. By then, the suburbanization had brought about a thorough, extensive, and permanent land use segregation in the metropolis for the thousands of Mexicans, Japanese, and Black Americans who lived amidst the commerce and industry in the small, quote, ghettos of central LA and San Pedro, the port. There were 1 million white people who resided in the suburbs, sprawling north to Hollywood, east Pasadena, south to Long Beach, and west to Santa Monica. So in this pattern of white Los Angeles in the 1920s, you can almost begin to visualize the geography of white Los Angeles kind of in a belt. I should have put in a picture of the University of Virginia racial dot map, but kind of this constellation going from like Santa Monica over on the left upwards into Hollywood and then toward Pasadena to the east, the northeast. What else? Does anyone have any questions? Okay. So now let's talk about the linear narrative of zoning. Kolnick. So in order to do so, we're going to get into another important like intro to city planning concept, which is an aesthetic and kind of social movement in the field of city planning in the early 20th century called City Beautiful, which, yeah, hold on. Sorry, guys. Okay. According to the linear history, the practice of zoning, or districting as it was originally known, was first nationally promoted as an inaugural city planning conference in 1909 as a rational, progressive era solution to what many attendees saw as an increasingly spatially and socially disordered urban environment. A number of speakers at the conference discussed the advantages of adopting a more extensive and uniform zone system of districting that would protect residence areas and allow industry to freely and efficiently develop in others. Some pointed out that Germany had already achieved great success with zone systems. So this really emerged in the predecessor era to the progressive movement in the US, where you had architects, planners and a lot of people that were really invested in this other emergent philosophy of like scientific management think that cities and the way space was administered could be made very symmetrical, very almost like Palace of Versailles looking, very much like, rational and orderly. And that's really embodied. The top left image here is a famous picture from, I think, like the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The important thing to know, you'll probably see this if you study city planning later on, but the important thing to know is these buildings are actually all plaster and they were made temporarily and they were put up. This is a statue of Athena. And it was really an example to market this ascendant idea of city beautiful. On the bottom here, you see a newspaper clipping. I think, I don't know. I cut out the year, I guess. I think it's from like 1916 or something. Anyway, it's from I think Salem, Oregon or something. But they'd said, we adopted zoning so that we can make for a beautiful symmetric growth. And then here's more city beautiful. So that's the philosophical, social background of this movement at the time. And so the dominant narrative of zoning takes you to New York in 1916. With the support of real estate, insurance, and development interests, New York City attempted to answer, quote, that great question of private property ownership rights in 1916 with a comprehensive ordinance that regulated use, bulk, and height of structures on private property. This was in response to the construction of a massive, massive skyscraper at the time called the Equitable Building, which you see on the left and casts massive, massive shadows on nearby buildings. It was like 200 stories tall or something like that. This comprehensive ordinance eventually became a model for other cities. The Federal Commerce Department's Advisory Committee on City Planning under Herbert Hoover promoted the idea of planning and zoning in the early 1920s and published a uniform zoning template in 1926. Okay, that's not that important. The same year, 10 years after New York City implemented its zoning plan, the Supreme Court ruled in Euclid v. Ambler Realty that a zoning plan was an appropriate and constitutional use of a city's police powers. So the dominant pattern that we'll see is that a city establishes some sort of new land use regulation, and then it's challenged in courts by whoever the offended party is. And then the courts, surprisingly, and a lot of times, reaffirm the city's ability to rule back private property rights in terms of what you can do with a piece of land you own, and say that the benefit to the larger communal good means that the city of New York, for example, had the ability to require building massings in such a way that prevented shadows. Does anyone have any questions? Okie doke. Okay, but let's not give New York all the credit, okay? It's not really accurate, historically speaking, to say that all of a sudden a bunch of enlightened architects, lawyers, specifically a lawyer named Edward Bassett, and other enlightened policymakers came together, and in the name of the emergent American progressive movement, gave American cities zoning. Land use regulations have existed long before that, and zoning just happened to be the most public-facing and comprehensive version of land use regulations that emerged in 1916 in New York for the first time. Before that, you had laws that limited the massing of buildings because of fires. You had laws that, in 1906, after the San Francisco earthquake, required that buildings be stuck together. So there were such things as, and it's just that the New York example really became the most comprehensive and most visible. Okay, where are we now? So these regulations in Los Angeles prior to 1916, and they existed. Let's talk about the municipal boundary first. In 1850, the city of Los Angeles was started prior to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the transfer of California to the United States. And we can see in this map on the right from Kathy Kolnick's 300-page PhD dissertation, which that was rough. She annexed the city of Los Angeles slowly annexed land and grew. And you can kind of, I love this map actually. You can like see the different years where it grew. And the process by which this happened was that the voters in the city and the voters outside of the city who were about to be annexed both had to vote and reach a simple majority for the boundary of the city to expand. And oftentimes before 1910s, communities outside of a large city were actually very eager to be annexed, something that became reversed later on. And so here you can see at the bottom of this map, there's that weird, the city of LA is so oddly shaped, and you can kind of understand why from looking at this. But notably, you have the shoestring expansion, which is, going down to San Pedro. I don't know if you could see that. We learned about the San Pedro Harbor. And in 1909, the city added what was called the shoestring annexation in order to pick up the land of San Pedro. And that increased the value of assessed land in the city of Los Angeles by like 70% in one fell swoop. That also came about with the introduction of the Owens Valley River Aqueduct that was brought by William Mulholland, which basically, solved and continues to solve the drought issue, which that was a reading for the second lecture, and I didn't include that. My bad. But anyway, land use regulations. We got off topic. In 1880s and 1890s, Los Angeles, like many cities across the country, still employed a complex and uncoordinated system of nuisance-based sanitary codes, fire limits, and single-purpose district, land use regulations that addressed a single type of use or occupation, and often a specific incidence at a particular time and place. So a lot of times, land use regulations prior to contemporary zoning were sort of like neighbors dealing with neighborly problems. And we can see this. I made a quick list of some of the reasons why land use problems arose in the first place in Los Angeles. Kind of the age in the 1890s, transitioning away from, the Wild West. You had this influx of Midwesterners who came in and had a very pro or anti-alcohol sentiment. So liquor licenses became a huge catalyst for land use disputes. Same thing with brothels, and actually they were legal, surprising to a lot of Californians, prior to like sometime around World War I. I think people from New Orleans, hi Keith, know that history a little bit more familiarly. And cemeteries were also a major land use controversy around the residential areas northeast of downtown Los Angeles. There was even an instance of people like suing over like roosters and stuff like that, cows, oil rigs. The one that we're going to get into most specifically. Oh, Keith, I think your mic is unmuted.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no problem. How's it going?
Oh, it's going good. Thank you. I'm just enjoying your session.
I'm glad you could join. The one that we're going to get into most importantly in understanding the pre-19, well, in Los Angeles, like New York style zoning was adopted in 1921, but the most relevant land use dispute has to do with the debate over Chinese laundries. Oh, before that though, in 1894, how are we doing on time? Okay, we're good. In 1894, so this is another example, not the Chinese laundries yet. Los Angeles City Health Inspector Dr. Francis W. Stedden proposed an ordinance to amend the city's health, sanitary, and quarantine regulations to add steam carpet beating establishments to the already listed manual carpet cleaning business prohibition within 100 feet of a home, school, or church. So the business owner of this new steam carpet cleaning business, James Lacey, was subsequently cited under the ordinance. He appealed and it went to the California Supreme Court in 1895, who ruled that the Los Angeles City Council was acting within its constitutionally vested police rights, as well as obligations to protect public health, even though they admitted that the actual nuisance caused by the steam cleaning service was non-existent. The point was that the city's police powers allowed it to regulate the operation of the business. The Los Angeles Times called this in 1895 one of the most, quote, considerable local case one of considerable local importance to the operations of local government, as the court confirmed the city's land use of regulatory power. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, now onto Chinese laundries. So in order to understand the kind of racial animus that was in the air of California at the time, you really have to understand that the way, well, we're kind of seeing a resurgence of this, unfortunately, but anti-Chinese sentiment in California was especially vicious in 1890s. I think, in 1882, we saw the nationwide passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which, by the way, if you've been paying attention to the denaming of Bolt Hall at UC Berkeley, you kind of understand the history. John Bolt, the guy who the law school is named after, he actually was a major architect of that piece of really racist legislation. But anyway, in the late 19th century, a major source of cheap labor in California and in other places, and we touched upon this with discussion at Promontory Point, were Chinese men who came from Qing Dynasty era southern China. They immigrated and they worked oftentimes segregated to Chinatowns because of the racial animus at the time. So Chinese laborers, after major projects were finished, railroads, agriculture, in response to the urbanizing environment at the time, were really both relegated and expanded commerce into more domestic labor areas. One of the most notable ones was laundry, in addition to a lot of restaurants. And this was a major presence in old Chinatown in Los Angeles. You often think about Chinatown now today. I should have included a map of this, but that's a whole other history we can talk about if anyone's interested. But basically, old Chinatown is where currently Union Station is, and there was a large Chinese community kind of near Alvera Street in downtown Los Angeles. In 1904, the 1904 residence districts, 30 people who listed addresses in the vicinity of 4th, Figueroa, and Flower Streets in downtown Los Angeles signed and presented a petition to the city council in 1903. It stated that the establishment of laundries in the residence district was a nuisance, adversely affecting property values, and requested an ordinance to protect them from Chinese laundries. This was despite the fact that at the time, I think Kolnick wrote that there were 4 Chinese laundries in the area. It required a laundry business to acquire licenses to operate, with the cost escalating as the number of delivery wagons increased. Such a measure would give the city the power to regulate the location of laundries through the granting of licenses. On July 26, 1904, the Los Angeles Examiner reported that the city council adopted residence district in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd wards. So this is really important. And in order to understand this new kind of form of spatial land use regulation, you have to understand what a ward is. So at the time, I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with what city council districts are, which are, in a city, you have a body of representatives that represent different geographic areas within a municipality, similar to the way we can think about states and Congress members. And those elected representatives would be beholden to the interests of their constituents. So the dilemma at the time, 1904, a lot of residents did not want Chinese laundries located in their neighborhoods, not in my backyard. So the elected representatives of the city of Los Angeles, the ones that were most beholden to these anti-Chinese sentiments, decided to make their voting precincts the boundaries of this exclusionary policy. And it's important to keep in mind that the policy coincided with voting wards. This excluded laundries and wash houses from their limits. Boundaries were drawn to include residence areas and exclude existing business areas. Oh, never mind. I just was completely wrong. Okay, I just got some history wrong there, so you're gonna have to question what I just said. Okay, so this was the beginning of land use districts in the city of Los Angeles prior to the New York zoning ordinance of 1916. We're getting really, really in the weeds here, by the way. You see the progression of these kind of disparate uses of land uses as time went on. In 1908, a lot of these residence-only districts expanded northeast, and also kind of in the areas just north of downtown LA, kind of where we think of current Bunker Hill area is. And also the normalization of residential districts along the LA River, as we've discussed as well. Another major court case came in the statewide Supreme Court, when which established to answer the question of the limits or extents of how far cities could take these kind of new land use regulations. A powerful 1913 newspaper graphic of a towering California Supreme Court judge with a model-size Los Angeles arrayed before him, manifestly yanking up factories to situate them elsewhere, was published shortly after the judicial decisions in the Chuang, Wo, and Montgomery cases, and the announcement of the campaign to remove businesses from residential sections is a compelling image and one that highlights the role of courts in affirming at least the legality of districting, or zoning, as it later became to be known, as a legitimate municipal function, as well as the perception of the power of court decisions. So now we've made a connection between proto-zoning in the city of Los Angeles and racial animus. That was the biggest thing I needed to accomplish. How are we doing on time? Oh my gosh, okay. So anyway, did I just run out of battery? Oh God.